Hi, this is Bill Denton, and welcome to the CrossTies video series on the Gospel of Mark. I invite you to join me and my friend Philip Burgess as we sit down together and talk about Mark as a story. It's a little bit different way to study the Bible, and especially the Gospel of Mark, but I think you'll find it interesting. Philip and I are just going to sit down together and enjoy some conversation about the Gospel of Mark. We invite you to sit in on that conversation. I think that you will learn a lot. I think you will appreciate the approach that we take looking at Mark as a story, trying to understand the story of God, the story of Jesus, the story that Mark was trying to communicate through his little short book. Thank you so much for joining us. By the way, if you're watching on YouTube or others, go to our YouTube channel on CrossTies Ministry. And be sure to give us a thumbs up, click that subscribe button, ring the notification bell, and that way you'll get notified whenever we put a new video up on this series. Thank you so much for joining us. We hope that you enjoy it and get a lot out of your Bible study. Well, Phil, we've been planning on this for quite some time now, to start this discussion between the two of us on the book of Mark. And I've been really looking forward to this. And when we talked about doing this series, we talked about approaching Mark as a story. And the two of us are going to do different parts of this thing. You're going to really dig into story and stories as we go through Mark. And then I'm going to do more of the old mundane Bible study stuff. You know. But I think this will be a really interesting discussion. We're not gonna dig into deep theology. You know, I don't think Mark was written to PhD students. You know, Mark was written to the average common person in the street. And so our approach to this, I hope, is going to be something that the average person can gain from the book of Mark. What is it that it's all about, that sort of thing. So why don't we start, and you just talk to me about stories.
I'll be glad to.
All right.
And Bill's stories are so important in our lives. From the time we are a small child until adulthood, we hear stories over and over again. Personally, for me, I was very fortunate to live in a small community up in North Alabama. And one of my favorite things to do was to either sit on the front porch with my granddaddy, Paul Burgess, and listen to him tell stories about his life in the Appalachian Mountains up in North Georgia. And when my daddy would go to the little country store in our community, I'd love to sit around the pot-bedded stove in the back of the store and listen to the farmers tell stories. Stories are so important to us because they motivate us, they help us with our emotions, and when we talk in biblical terms, what great stories that are embodied in the Bible, and Mark is certainly no exception. As we look at, as we begin this study, there's so many rich stories that we can talk about and expound on within the truths of the Bible itself.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. You talk about the community you grew up in, listening to people tell stories. I think one of my favorite things about my youth was going out to my granddaddy's house and listening to him tell stories. Now, I got to be honest with you, I used to think that he was making up a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
And I will tell you personally one time this one story that I have in my head, but I was sure that he was making the story up. And lo and behold, he went and pulled out a newspaper article and pretty much validated everything that he said.
Yeah.
But it's a crazy story about some of my ancestors, you know. But you're right. Story can give you a sense of a place, you know, where you belong and where you came from, and maybe some idea about where you're going.
Yeah, and I recall one of those silly stories from Nip to Rips Need More Grocery, where I was reared, and I know that the farmers were pulling my leg, but they gave me this story about a huge black snake that could bite its tail, and it could roll down the dirt road. And for days I was afraid to get on my bike and ride along the dirt road around our house. But and I knew it was true, but still it scared me to death.
Yeah, that snake, by the way, rolled all the way from Alabama to Mississippi.
Oh, you heard about that too? Well, that's a great story, isn't it? Yeah. So I think that telling stories has been around since the caveman. When you look at archaeological, through the lens of an archaeologist, you'll see that the cavemen recorded their stories on the walls of their caves. It wasn't a spoken word, it was indeed paintings that they used to tell their story.
Right.
And the Native Americans, whom did not have an alphabet until Sequoyah invented one later on in the history of the Native Americans, they had an oral tradition in which from year to year, generation to generation, they handed down the oral traditions and the oral stories. And embodied in that was which plants and animals were good for eating, which plants were good for healing. All of those oral traditions were handed down. And today I think we miss some of that. We're so busy with our computers and with our cell phones, and children today just are missing the idea of sitting around Grandpa, as you and I did, and listening to those rich, delicious stories.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. And it's why, you know, when we talked about this approach to studying Mark, to look at it as a story, I think even in church, in Sunday school classes, you know, when I was growing up, the method of Bible study was known as verse by verse, you know.
Yes.
Well, okay, I understand that, but honestly, I think it's a terrible approach to Bible study. You miss the context so often of where that verse appears, and then it's easy to just read a verse, and then now your imagination may go somewhere way beyond where the writer of that verse intended for you to go. And I think, yes, we may want to make some application out of that, but you first have to understand, what did this guy mean when he wrote whatever it is that he wrote? What was he trying to say to his original audience? And we have a hard time getting that. And we lose it when we lose the story approach, because the Bible is a story. From Genesis to Revelation, it's telling us a story. And yes, there are a lot of individual stories that make up the big story, but it's pretty much like any good novel, you know. There are sections about different people in a novel, and yet the novel itself tells a story. So I think we need to restore that, and that's kind of what I want us to do in this series. So.
Yeah, as a journalism graduate and as one who practiced journalism for the majority of my life before I retired, you know, the first thing you learn is who, what, when, where, and why. Those are the 5 questions of journalism, and basically those are the 5 questions you strive to answer in any good news story. And when you look at the Bible, when you read a chapter, those are the 5 questions that you should ask yourself and answer, and there's a reason that those questions are answered, and you need to pay attention to that as you overall read the story.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And we will, of course, look at many of those, all of those questions as we go through Mark, because that's how the story develops. It's developed with the characters. You know, we don't call them characters usually. We call them people. You know, the people in the story. Well, but they're characters in Mark's story. The places, the actions that take place. All of that goes together. The writer of this little book called Mark, the Gospel of Mark, is employing all of these things to try to bring us into a world that he's creating for us. We're sitting on the outside. The writer of the book of Mark also sits on the outside. He sits and he's looking in. He has all the knowledge and the information in his head that nobody else has. The characters within the story, well, they're sometimes clueless, about what's actually going on. You got Jesus, who's the main character and that the story is about, but it's putting all of this stuff together, and then we have to try to, well, why is he telling us this story? What's the point? What are you trying to convince me of by telling me this story? So all of that goes exactly to what you're talking about with the pieces, the elements that make up the story.
And one of the unique things I think about the stories of the Bible is that Mark is writing to a specific audience that may be a little different from what Matthew or Luke or John wrote to, and you can compare different aspects of each of their stories, and then you get the whole picture.
Yeah, it's just weird sometimes the way that we ignore the obvious. This book, as with, I think you could say the other three Gospels in particular, were written as stories. Now you get past Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and now you're dealing more with letters,
right,
that were written. Well, letters are not really a story in the same sense that Mark is, although there are some stories that are included in the letters. But these four books that begin the New Testament are really interesting. I suppose that you might say, on a very basic level, that they are biographies of Jesus, although they may or may not exactly fit the idea of a biography. It's pretty abbreviated if it is a biography. We're missing a whole lot of information about Jesus. And so people love to make up stuff about Jesus. All through the ages, people have made up things about Jesus that may or may not be true. The reliable information that we have is in these four little books that we call gospel accounts. But they are definitely a story, and Mark is the shortest of all of them. He is the short story writer.
Right, he is.
And so he's big on action. He moves from one thing to the next pretty quickly. He doesn't give us a whole lot of fluff. He gives us spare details. In a sense, he gives us enough information so that we know who we're talking about, we know where we are, we know what they're doing, those kinds of things. But there's so much that's left out that now I think it taps into our imaginations, and we have to fill it out. We do that kind of naturally as we read things. So it's a great way to learn what Mark said. That's the factual stuff, I guess, the text of the matter. But then we try to take it in, and now we have to let our minds massage it and figure out what it means and how do we use this.
Yeah, one of my favorite authors is Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens, and his stories are great because he introduces us to a variety of characters.
Yeah.
You've got Tom Sawyer, and you've got Jim, and you've got all the other characters in that story. Well, Mark does the same thing. He talks about John. He doesn't elaborate a whole lot, but he tells us that John was this weird character that ate locusts, and he didn't cut his hair, and then he walks. Then we find him walking down by the seashore, Jesus, and he makes fishermen of men that just drop what they're doing. And those are great stories. And those characters, as we follow them, not only through Mark, but through the rest of the Bible, they develop themselves and become the great men who established and helped establish what we call Christianity today.
Yeah. I love Mark Twain. I've got some good Mark Twain books. One of my more recent favorite authors, who passed away a couple of years ago, I think, and I don't know how to pronounce her name. I think it's Maeve. It's Maeve Binchy. Maeve Binchy. She's an Irish lady, and she writes wonderful character novels. And what she does is she writes about a person, and then the whole rest of the book is how that person connects with all these other people and how their stories interact with one another. Well, then she writes another book, and the next book is about some character that she wrote about in the first one, and she carries on, the story, and then she writes another book, and you got to read all of them,
Yeah.
And by the time you get through, you have tied together an entire community of people, and some outsiders, who come in. It's just fascinating stuff, it really is.
And that's simply true of the Bible and Jesus himself. You have to understand the Gospels and the development of those characters and what a role they play with the life of Jesus himself.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So we're going to follow this through, and I was thinking about the book of Mark as a story, and it does have all the elements of a story. It has a beginning, has a middle, has an end.
Right.
And all the way through, the point that the writer is trying to get to, I believe, the main point, is to try to get people to really see Jesus and to ask themselves the same question that the disciple, or he asked of his disciples, who am I? And so the original reason for writing this book, I've read some different things, commentators have some ideas about stuff, and I think there are at least two that are really important. One is that Mark was written not to outsiders, Mark was written to insiders. In other words, Mark was written to a Christian community, people who were already Christians. If that's the case, then the original reason for writing this book that we know as the Gospel of Mark was not to convert people, but to keep people convinced and to give them information about Jesus that would spur their imagination, that would touch their hearts, that would, make their faith a more solid thing. Beyond that, then I think that's great, but then would the Gospel of Mark have any purpose for someone outside the Christian community? Well, yeah.
Yes, it does.
I think any opportunity that a person has to learn about Jesus is an opportunity to develop faith, to believe that he is the Son of God, that he came into the world with a mission from God, that really his life and death and resurrection is all about the rule and the reign of God, the kingdom of God coming into this world of ours. And so it is at the same time, a message to the in crowd, but it is also a message to the outside crowd. And so it kind of depends on where you are as you read this story as to what it might mean to you. If you're already a believer, this book will do some things for you that are different from what it will do to someone who is an unbeliever.
And I think you're exactly right. And I think for the believer, if you go back and you read Mark, maybe you've read it 20 times, but after you read it and you apply the who, what, when, where, and why, you're going to discover some new things that you haven't even thought about before. And for the unbeliever, if you apply that same thing, you're also going to learn some things that may lead you to a different place in life.
Right. That's exactly right. So, and this is the great thing about stories to me, is I can read the same story multiple times.
Right.
I will always see something
something new.
Yeah, and always see something new. And sometimes I'll go, man, how did I miss that? You know, I've read this thing 3 times. How did I miss that first two times through? So it is an opportunity to continue to gather information. And this, the wonderful thing to me about stories is that a good story never really gets old to me. It's something that you can read, or if it's presented to you in the form of a movie, you can watch it several times. And now I will watch movies that I've seen, you know, dozens of times. And now I look for little details that I would have never paid any attention to. I look for signs in the background. You know, I'll look for one of my favorite things to do is to look for where the continuity guy messed up.
Yeah, I do that too.
When scenes switch, you know.
I do that too.
Most of the time they get it right, but every now and then it is a really obvious thing.
Yeah, exactly.
And you know, oh man, they forgot to take that stick out. You know, lots of funny stuff. But you always learn things, and so as a person reads through the Gospel of Mark, you read through the first time, and there will be things that really stand out, jump out to you, information that really impresses you. The next time through, though, there will be something else.
Sure.
That illuminates the first stuff that you read.
And you'll say, why didn't I see that the first time?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Well, anything else on stories you want to share?
Well, I want to be a storyteller myself.
Yeah.
I like to write, and that's what I've done for a great portion of my life is to write. And I don't know that I'm a good writer. I've been exposed to a lot of interesting people and interesting things over the years, and I've tried to hold on to my childhood and the farm and the rural folks, and I love them dearly. But stories to me are just so rich. They are just a part of the fabric of who I am, and I think that people are hunger and thirsty for the stories that make them feel good, that make them think about things, that make them realize that maybe they're moving too fast and missing a lot of things. And I think if a storyteller can make a person say, whoa, and slow down and think about certain things in life, I think they have succeeded.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Well, I hope that this little discussion we've had that really sort of introduces what it is we're going to be doing. We haven't even gotten into the Gospel of Mark, haven't even opened the Bible yet, but this is what we're going to do with it, and I think people need to know how we're approaching this and what our goals are as we try to dig into the Gospel of Mark. And so we invite you folks to continue to come join Philip and myself as we dig into the Gospel of Mark and see the story that Mark presents to us about a fellow named Jesus. It's going to be interesting.
And we look forward to seeing you next time.
Amen.